It's not just that we are building systems that are based on these technologies, but that we're building systems on top of systems on top of systems. And so if you're not represented in any kind of base level, then that means you're not going to be able to play Pokemon Go. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I guess I'm representing the art, the holding it down for artists here. Thank you. Thanks for the cheers. So the way I want to start is with a story. But specifically, this is with a story that I wrote over a year ago when I was working as a data journalist at Publication Quartz. And it's pretty explicit. It says in the title, side-by-side images expose a glitch in Google's maps. And what this talks about is how for all the location-based data that Google has, there are still these spots that don't show up on the maps. And we know that because if we look at aerial photography, we can still see those things. So I'll show a couple examples. So this is Mokoko. This is a floating lake community off the coast of Lagos, Nigeria. And there are about 100,000 people who live there. Those are rough estimates. And you can see the satellite imagery on one side and then the map data on the other side. And you see that that whole region where there are about 100,000 people looks virtually empty. This is another one. This is in Chad. This is the Lake Fitri drainage basin. About 2 million people live in this entire area. And the majority of the region, looks virtually invisible on the map. This is in Mongolia, Gobi Desert. I think you're maybe getting the idea of what you're going to see. Once again, no representation on these maps. And then my favorite one, this is one of the favelas. It's called Morro dos Prazeres, and it's favela in the heart of Rio in Brazil. And you can see the side where everybody lives on. And once again, you don't see very much. We do get in this one a little bit in that corner. You can see some of these houses. But for the most part, it doesn't really show up. It's not being represented. So the question is, what's actually happening here? And I said, you saw the title of the article, which says this was about Google's maps. But in fact, this isn't really a Google-specific issue at all. It has nothing to do with Google, per se. And we know this for two reasons. One of those reasons is that Google has put a lot of work into trying to map these areas. The reason I'm focusing now on this one in Rio is because ahead of the Rio Olympics, Google sent out a bunch of people to try to map a lot of the favelas using backpacks and various other kind of lo-fi technology. So they've tried really, really hard, but even still, only 2% of the favelas in Rio are mapped. And then we also know this isn't a Google-specific issue because if you look at maps created by other people, so for instance, has anybody heard of OpenStreetMap? Great, okay. So then for people who haven't heard of it, OpenStreetMap is an open source mapping system, so anybody can kind of generate the data. And it's not just proprietary data. And if you go to OpenStreetMap, you'll see pretty much the same story, where if you look at these exact areas, they don't really show up. So the question is, what is happening? And this is the exact thing that I'm interested in. What I would say that we are seeing are these really interesting tension points, where it's not that anybody is trying to do anything wrong. In fact, in a lot of these situations, people are trying to collect that data, but in fact, it can't be collected because of the very nature of the spaces themselves. And the way that they are is that they resist the ways that we collect data in the world. And to me, that is really, really, really interesting. And as an artist, that's what I spend most of my time thinking about and looking at, is that I try to think about what are these spaces that kind of highlight the tensions in our world, which is increasingly becoming machine readable. As you've already heard, as this entire session is about, when I say that the world is becoming machine readable, what I mean is that we are collecting more and more data. And because we are collecting more and more data, because we have more digital devices, because all of us are increasingly becoming agents and subjects of data collection every day, there becomes a need for the world to fit forms of data. So we start prioritizing things that are data. And what that means is that if you can't be fit into a kind of data set, if you can't fit into a spreadsheet or into a cell, then there's something that happens. There's a kind of rupture that happens there. And that is very interesting to me. And so what I try to do is spend most of my time thinking about those implications, those social implications, the political implications, the cultural implications of what happens in those moments when things kind of don't match up. And I'm going to come back to this one. The reason why I said that this example is my favorite one is not because there's anything objectively better about it, but really because the way that I found out about this entire situation, about these places that weren't showing up, is through an article that was written by a Brazilian academic named Ronaldo Lemos. If anyone speaks Portuguese, you understand this. If not, you probably still maybe get a little bit of it, which is that when Pokemon Go first came out, nobody in the favelas in Rio could play. And the reason for that is because the creators of Pokemon Go, Niantic Incorporated, some of them used to work with Google, and the underlying data that they used came from Google's maps. And so what that meant is that anything that they built off of that, of course, things that weren't represented in the maps weren't going to be represented in the games. And so you ended up having this very strange situation where Pokemon Go came out, and then this entire group of people found that they couldn't participate in it. And the reason I like this is because it feels very frivolous and very trivial in some ways, in that you're like, oh, it's just a game, it's Pokemon. Why do we even need to think about that? But in fact, it illustrates this greater point, which is that it's not just that we are building systems that are based on these technologies, but that we're building systems on top of systems on top of systems. And so if you're not represented in any kind of base level, then that means you're not going to be able to play Pokemon Go. For the first iteration, they fixed it afterwards. Now they can play. But at least in the very beginning. And the point that Ronaldo Lemos makes in this article is he talks about future things, like some of the things we've already been discussing in this session, things like automated cars. If you don't show up on a map, how on earth are you going to be able to take advantage of things like automated cars, self-driving cars? And the answer is that you won't. And so you start to see that there are these ripple effects that happen from this. So, as I said, my name is Mimi. I am an artist, but I've gone by a lot of different titles at various points in my life. All of these titles are it doesn't really matter to me, use different ones depending on the space, but all of them really stem from this fact that, as I said, I'm really interested in looking at the implications of data collection. And not just looking at it, but trying to find ways of thinking and representing and showing it so that we can understand this in a way that's not just academic, but actually feels very, in some ways emotional, but just very present. So what I'm trying to do is kind of turn on a head the way that we normally think about these issues, which for many feel really abstract and in the air. And what I want to do is kind of bring them down to earth so that we can see what actually this means for us. And I want to show a big project that I've worked on in the past, which I think kind of exemplifies this in some ways, and also connects very, very much to this theme of AI and moral machines. And this is a project that I've been working on for a long time that is called Missing Datasets. So when I say missing datasets, what I am referring to is what I like to call blank spots in otherwise data-saturated spaces. And what I started to notice a few years ago was that, once again, for all the data that we collect in the world, there are still these spots where no data seem to live. And I became really curious about that. And I started wondering, A, what are these things, and what are the examples of them? And also, what do they mean? And this is, for those of you who know, this is GitHub. I've written this up on GitHub. GitHub is this code sharing site. I like to use it not for sharing code, but just projects and thoughts and ideas. And so the thing that's great about it is that anybody can do a pull request or a push request. So you can actually, if you have comments or you disagree with something, it's really easy to kind of push that there, and then we can have a conversation with it. So this still exists. So you can do that with this project. So here are some examples of missing data sets. This is actually an old list. It's not entirely updated, but I'll go through and talk about a few of them. And what I started to discover is that rather than focusing on the actual data sets, because that can become it can become tempting to want to fetishize the data sets, what's more interesting is thinking about the reasons why things aren't being collected, what I like to call these patterns of absence. And really what I started to discover is that there are four reasons why you get missing data. This is the first one, and it is that people who have the resources to collect data will lack the incentives to collect it. And a good example of this is stingrays. So in the US, a lot of police departments use stingrays, which are these cell phone towers. These are these towers that are meant to imitate cell phone towers so that you can get some metadata from people's phones. And we know that police stations around our country have them, but we don't know who has them. And that data technically is out there, but we as the public can't access it. So let's say that's a missing data set. And so once again, you see the people who have the resources to give that data away, such as the police